in January, you may notice a difference on menus at restaurant chains in Ontario. The government has passed legislation requiring calorie counts on menu items. Critics say the new rules announced in March don't go far enough, however, and they're pointing fingers at who the government hired to consult on the changes. Mary Scorbatakos is a postdoctoral researcher with the Department of Nutritional Sciences at the University of Toronto. So now, when we talk about critics, Mary, the NDP health critic has been very vocal on this, saying, you know, it stinks. But before we get to the details, what is it that nutritionists would have liked to have seen in these new rules?
So ideally, it would have been great for restaurants to disclose not only calorie information on their menus, but also sodium information. And there's two reasons for that. First, we know that restaurant foods are alarmingly high in terms of their sodium content. We know that you can go to a restaurant and get your full day's worth, maybe even 2 days worth of sodium from just one meal. And the second reason why displaying sodium is important is because from our own consumer research at U of T, we found that consumers want to see sodium information, and that when you put sodium information on a menu, consumers do make lower sodium choices.
So what the province was being encouraged to put both calorie counts and sodium on these labels, and we're talking about fast food restaurants, right?
That's right. All chain restaurants that have 20 or more locations. So it's both fast food restaurants as well as sit-down restaurants where you'll see a waiter. As long as they're a chain with 20 or more locations, they'll be subject to this law. And that's right. Many different health organizations and health advocates were calling for sodium and calorie information.
All right, so what happened, though, was what was announced was only the calorie counts. And as I mentioned, the NDP and other people have been pointing out that possibly one of the issues was this firm that was hired to advise the government about this whole new regulation. It's called Fleischmann-Hillard, that they also lobby the government on behalf of these fast food chains who didn't want any of this to happen, most of them. So people are saying, you know, this is really wrong. You've got, you know, the wrong side is advising the government on what should be done. What's your view of that?
Well, I think it's really interesting what happened with the debate around menu labeling in the province of Ontario. If we go back to 2010, when the debate was sort of just starting, we saw the restaurant industry being very adamant that they did not want to put calorie information on restaurant menus. But then 5 years later, when the provincial bill came up, they were pretty quiet. And I think the reason is because in the interim, in about 2013, we saw a lot of health advocates, as well as people like the Toronto Board of Health, recommending both calorie and sodium information. So when the recommendation changed from being just calories to being calories and sodium, suddenly the calorie-only bill became one that was more advantageous for the industry. So it's sort of understandable that the province might have been under pressure from the industry because they did choose to go with this slightly more watered-down version of the bill.
Now, the government did issue a statement today in response to this criticism, and it was saying that the firm, Fleischmann, was actually required to sign a conflict of interest statement, you know, that they presumably were not going to be influenced, or whether by the other side of their work, that is on behalf of restaurants and so forth. What do you make of that? Is that legitimate, do you think?
Well, I think it's important that whenever decisions are being made about how to regulate any kind of industry, it always kind of makes sense to not have the industry at the table when those decisions are being made. It's more transparent, it makes more sense. So the fact that they were involved when they were taking consumer views around this bill just sort of makes things somewhat suspicious.
So what are your concerns now that these rules are out and there is no sodium labeling? What does that mean?
Well, there are a couple of concerns. We know that now consumers will be making their food choices based only on calories, and sometimes a low-calorie menu item might be a high-sodium menu item, and consumers won't know that. We also know that the industry might make efforts to improve the calorie level of their meals because they'll be under pressure having to now disclose that number. And one of the ways that they might be able to cut back on calories is by adding more sodium. So it will be interesting to see how the industry responds and how people's choices change when they make decisions based only on calories and not having that other piece of information available to them.
And what's the great risk with sodium? Remind us.
The problem with sodium is that it's a risk factor for high blood pressure. And high blood pressure is a risk factor for heart disease, which is the leading cause of death in Canada and worldwide. So that's why we always want to be mindful of our sodium intake. And the problem is, people always think that their sodium is coming from the salt shaker. But what we know is that 70% of Canadians' dietary sodium intake, it's not coming from the salt shaker. It's coming from processed foods, and it's coming from restaurant foods. So restaurants are where you get sodium, and that's why it's so important to label there.
All right, might be something for the future, but not right now. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.